Disaster can be riveting, impossible to tear your eyes from. Perhaps never has this been clearer than in the last 4 years of particularly intensified mass spectator catastrophe. The 2 years of the plague, the year of the war, the year of the genocide. But at the same time, in many cases these real catastrophes have been substituted in the minds of the political right with a collection of other, mostly or entirely fake, emergencies. Instead of face the complexities of the COVID pandemic, many conspiracy theorists chose to imagine a fake emergency in which public health measures like lockdown were just the opening salvo of a totalitarian plot against them. Instead of climate change bringing hurricanes and wildfires, they preferred to imagine a plot by Antifa, or even meteorologists. And in the UK this August, instead of the violent tragedy of a so far unexplained triple murder, they preferred to imagine a tide of evil Muslims taking over their country. This replacement of one tricky disaster with another simplified disaster, often with a concrete enemy you can blame or even attack, is part of what Richard Seymour calls disaster nationalism, a psychological dust storm of horrors that both threatens the far right and allows them a kind of release that ends up in a renewed attachment to the nation. My name is Richard Seymour, and on this episode of Novara FM I spoke to Richard Seymour about why a politics of pure economic interest cannot be enough for an era of piling catastrophes, how to make sense of the violent urges that have intensified the Gaza genocide, and how the left can approach the end of the world with a sober class hatred. Richard Seymour, welcome to Novara FM.
Thank you very much.
In the last week, we've seen one of the most powerful hurricanes in history hit Florida. Inside this hurricane was mixed up a whole collection of conspiratorial formulations, the idea that the hurricane was not a natural phenomena, or not, as we might say, a natural phenomena intensified by anthropogenic climate change, but a conspiracy theory that instead the hurricane itself was constructed, that it was made by evil Democrats or made by evil meteorologists even to pummel the people of Florida, to condemn them, to punish them for their, whatever it is that people in Florida think they deserve to be punished for. This was then mediated through the liberal press, who declared that the people who were spreading these conspiracy theories were Russian trolls, that it came from outside, and so on. And I want not to sort of talk about the sort of fact-checking aspect of this, the intricacies of how I might say, oh no, actually, but I think you will find, blah, 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 blah. But to talk about what is so alluring in the image of disaster, what is so alluring for the right, or indeed people in general, about this feeling of being assailed, this feeling of being punished for something. How do you understand that?
It's a specific type of disaster. Let's be clear about this. We do live in a disaster-rich world. If you like disasters, there's plenty of them coming at you. One of my favorite examples I talk about in disaster nationalism is the Oregon wildfires 2020. Because if you want to be, punished, if you want to be threatened, you're surrounded by flames 10 meters long, 800 degrees Celsius, and they're going to kill you. And instead, what a lot of people there do is decide that these fires, there are too many of them, they're too hot, they're too weird. It must have been set by Antifa. And Antifa must be in the pay of the Democratic Party. They must be terrorist mercenaries out to kill conservative white Christians. And there are people who refuse to evacuate because, as one guy said, if I see people doing crap, I'm going to hurt them. So they've been told to evacuate. Level 3, worst you can get. They won't go. And there's even something noble about this idea. Now, what's really happening here, again with the example you gave, and I was paying attention to that one too, because Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was the author of if you remember, the Jewish space lasers theory of bad weather, yes. She stirred up controversy, and the liberal press always think it's sufficient to correct her, but that's not the way these things work. There's nothing intrinsically alluring about disasters. There's nothing rewarding about experiencing them. Kai Erikson, the sociologist of disasters, spent decades looking into this. And, like historically, there used to be the idea that in disasters, people pull together, a city of comrades, democracy of distress.
A paradise built in hell is
What Rebecca Solnit.
Yeah.
And it has its moments, and it's not wholly wrong. But the problem is that kind of paradise only happens where the community wasn't always already riven by class, ethnic, gender tensions, which is a rare, or where there's been a build-up of communal solidarity, self-help, cooperativism, etc. So people, do pull together under the circumstances, but quite often there's a kind of what Kai Erikson calls a psychological concussion, a deadening, a flattening, a silencing, a retreat to the survivalist peripheries of life. But here's what disaster nationalism does. It gives you an alternative disaster, one that's much more extreme and evil and salacious, one that is much more agentive. It's done by somebody. Somebody is doing this to you. If your problem is climate change, that's a big, abstract, difficult problem to deal with. If your problem is Antifa, you can shoot them. Or, if it's a corporation, you can take them to court, something like that. Capitalism, climate change, these are big, difficult problems, even if you were to acknowledge them. The only response might be, given the lack of organization, etc., to just retreat to passivity. And that's the most common response, right? But if you tell people that, the suffering that you've been undergoing is caused by something that corresponds to the demons in your head. The demons in your head are real. They're out there, and you can shoot them. You can shoot Antifa, you can shoot Black Lives Matter, you can go down and do a bit of vigilantism, and then you can turn up at the Capitol and try to string up the communists in charge. Because this is the important thing. Just as with civil rights, the segregationists never believed that black people were fighting for their own liberation, they thought it was a put-up job by Jews and communists. In the same way, the argument about Antifa was they're just pawns. The real problem is the globalist, terrorist, pedophile, Satanist conspiracy. That's a very enthralling and exciting disaster to be faced with. And, I look at Michael Billig's psychosocial work on British fascism, and one of the things I'm struck by is how exciting it is to be threatened by somebody just once. I want somebody to threaten me just once so that I can hit them back. And that seems to be one of the only things that really differentiates the psychology of the fascist from the non-fascist. He was looking at the authoritarian personality, didn't find any trace of it. All of this other stuff.
This is a classic 1950s study by Adorno and a collection of
other... yeah. And, but, there's a range of theories from Erik Erikson, and so on. Wilhelm Reich. I actually have a soft spot for Wilhelm Reich's work. I think
interesting. We'll go into that.
Incredibly innovative, and one of the. I don't think he's entirely right, but I think this point about the contradictory nature of far right subjectivity, of being both rebellious and slavish in one body, and of needing an outlet for that aggression. And disaster nationalism gives you an outlet for aggression that is extremely sanguinary. It's extreme in its bloodiness because you have to kill a lot of people to remedy the problems that you face, according to this dispensation. But it doesn't touch the structures because it can't ascend to that level of abstraction and reach the systemic level and think about the system as a system, or rather refuses to. It leaves everything intact exactly as it was. So it becomes an authoritarian right project. And then you just look at how entertaining these conspiracy theories are. QAnon is a live-action role-playing game, which is also a kind of syncretic millenarian cult, which draws on the politically ambiguous and culturally fractious forms of 90s and 2000s conspiracism. A lot of that conspiracism had earlier flowed into anti-capitalist movement, anti-war movement. It had an ambiguous openness to the alien and to the alt,
yes.
It wasn't just about being threatened and, it wasn't purely reactionary. But it was all recruited very efficiently by a series of steps to a really radically authoritarian far-right orientation. So, we might want to think about what is so entertaining and enthralling about that, because as you know, and as probably Novara understands well to its cost, the right does much better out of social media in terms of money raising and so on than the left does. There's something about this stuff that works just so well for the social industry and its particular way of generating flows of attention.
There are so many things in there I want to come back to in the context of the far-right riots that we saw in August in the UK, and to try and take some of these notions of contradictory subjectivity and see if we can sort of land them there. But before we do that, I want to make sure that we've sort of grasped some sort of essential core of this argument, the sort of pithy, sloganized version of the argument you're making in the book. And I was thinking a bit about Guy Debord, who in The Society of the Spectacle, which is a book that people probably be familiar with. And that book has often been understood as really an argument about images. He's at pains to say this is not the case. Right? He says the spectacle is not a collection of images, but a social relation among people mediated by images. And I was wondering if we could say something similar about the politics of disaster, that disaster is not this collection of images, it's not even a collection of experiences, but it's at root, the disaster nationalist response to it is about a threat to a particular social relation, a threat to social stratification, which is then mediated by images. And we get attached to the images, we get stuck on the images. But really what's at risk here for the far right is social stratification, various forms of power.
Possibly, but I will equivocate over that one for this reason. I follow Kai Erikson in making the distinction between chronic and acute disasters. And the chronic disasters that afflict our lives, we don't have to be poor to experience them. We don't have to be, left behind, as it were. We don't have to be white working class, whatever that phrase is supposed to mean. The disasters that afflict our lives, the disappointments, the class injuries, the trajectories of decline, the failures, the toxic experience of failure, that is fairly ubiquitous and broadly distributed across class strata. And over a period of time, it can either be internalized, as it usually is, in a passive, self-loathing way, class shame, essentially, I say is the class consciousness of the defeated. It's also quite an apposite emotion in a neoliberal era in which social sadism and social Darwinism are the common response to failure and to you're being defeated. We're supposed to have an emulous and credulous culture of extolment of the successful, the Trumps, in other words, or the Musks. And we're supposed to feel contempt and pity for people who can't pay their debts, which is quite a lot of people.
And more often contempt than pity.
Although pity and contempt are in the same, they're part of the same spiral, I think. I don't trust either of them. But I think that people have experienced real disasters, and Oregon's a good example. The chronic disasters of poverty, of addiction, of deaths of despair, suicide, alcoholism. Even before the fentanyl crisis, Oregon had the worst addiction rates in America. And we're talking about rural Oregon, where really poor people live, and they're quite conservative, and they don't really have any local news, they don't have any infrastructures, they have nothing. And then a series of what you might call acute disasters comes. For them, COVID is a disaster that bespeaks the totalitarian reach of the state, It's the Fourth Reich or whatever. Not for all of them, but for a significant minority, let's say. For the mobilized and active minority. Black Lives Matter, well, that's treason. That's the incitement of the terrorist wing of the Democratic Party. And then comes the wildfires, and that's the really acute disaster, the one that's coming for you. And I would say that in this sense, disaster nationalism is a kind of a curative relation to what could be a traumatizing and depressing moment. It's an alternative to depression. And it's much better, much more efficient than the liberal bourgeois cures of cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness or happy pills, although those things can be made to work under certain circumstances, nothing against them per se, but it's a politicized solution to a problem that is deeply political. Left has been a bit behind on this, despite our reading of Mark Fisher and so on. I would prefer to approach this as one where the psychic and the social interconnect. So it's a psychosocial problem, one that can't be contained within the narrow strictures of class analysis, for example, but can't be done without class analysis either.
I went to Barnsley to cover some of the protests that happened in the aftermath of the riots. It wasn't a riot we were covering, but we were covering a protest. And the moment in that day that has really stuck with me is this moment at which someone from the Stand Up to Racism side, the sort of the anti-fascist side, says, "Don't blame the migrants," or sort of shouts across the town square, "Don't blame the migrants. It was Thatcher that ruined the North." And I put this, I sort of go down the steps and put a microphone in front of one of the far-right protesters and say, "Look, he's saying that. He's saying that it was Thatcher. It's not migrants. What do you make of that?" And he says, "Yes, it was Thatcher. She killed this country. She ruined the North. And that's no longer important." Right? And there's this sense of the sort of passing out of Thatcherism as the explanatory locus, or as the main kind of explanation for why it is that the North has been deprived structurally in the UK. How do you understand that sort of politics of cultural memory, even when the left has attained a sort of hegemony with its explanation? Yes, it was Thatcher, but that's no longer relevant. How do you understand that sort of historical time?
I mean, it in a way, of course, it's relevant, but if the left is still using that kind of argument, maybe we're kind of losing relevance, because we should be able to do better than that. It was Thatcher, but it was also Blair, and it's also Starmer. It's using Thatcher as a shortcut, as a way to get to activate a kind of common sense. I can understand that, but I would imagine that for many people, Thatcher has been dead a long time. Thatcher was last in government 40 years ago, or whatever it was. Also, I think part of the thing is that that defeat has already been assimilated, like a long time ago. So the idea of rebelling against Thatcherism just seems irrelevant. I think ultimately it is an indictment of the left. The reason why we can sort of invoke Thatcher is partly because the last real experience of resistance and rebellion was against Thatcher. And that's why those emotions still exist. Blair was doing the same thing, but there was no resistance to it. And therefore, the kind of intense feelings of communal solidarity against Thatcher did not exist with Blair or with Cameron. There was just a general feeling of, fuck them all, they're all the same. I don't care anymore. And actually, to be honest with you, if the politicians aren't going to look out for me, I'm going to look out for myself. They don't care about me, I don't care about them. That kind of retreat to the survivalist, individualist sort of portrayal of life.
Does that retreat then make fertile grounds for a particular kind of resentment that is usable from the far right?
Sure, except that I think part of what's happening is that if you had some kind of leftist organising, then there would have been a hegemonic response to austerity, to Blair's trashing of the North under the rubric of regional redevelopment and devolution and all the rest of it. And therefore, resentment would have been fairly clearly directed, and it would have become something other than and more than resentment, because resentment remains quite a reactive and honestly self-destructive emotion. It's a necessary emotion because it's a moral response to the world, but left is a bad place to get stuck. But I think what's really happened is that quite a lot of people detached from politics notice that life around them is getting worse, but maybe don't have a political explanation for that. So, for example, that there was a study done a few years ago, I think it was published by Glasgow University, which said that there were 300,000 excess deaths as a result of austerity across the UK. When those deaths were happening, most of the people would have been, their deaths would have been traced, etiologically to diabetes or heart disease or to overdose or something like that, not to austerity. And their friends and relatives might have, if they weren't particularly politically interested, they might have noticed the situation around them getting worse and just a general feeling of more and more threat in their lives, more stress, friends dying earlier, but maybe didn't have anything to fix that apprehension on. Maybe for some of them, there was a general sort of, since the newspapers were talking about immigrants all the time, maybe it's the immigrants coming over that are, bringing the quality of life down, taking away all our resources. We should look after our own first. How can they come in? I'm a citizen. I've paid into the system my whole life. How can they come in and they get everything? They get treated like royalty, and I get shat on. Those kind of subjectivities are very popular. I come from Northern Ireland, and I've known relatives, who, like a lot of working class people, are contradictory in their attitudes. But I will not name names, but a relative of mine once saw a homeless refugee begging in the street, selling Big Issue, I think it was, walked up to her and says, I bet you earn more than I do, and kicked her. And I thought it was the most disgusting and shameful thing I've ever heard. So if you're listening, you've been outed on national radio. But really, this is an extremely commonplace feeling that somebody has jumped the queue. And it's a reactionary, conservative feeling because, of course, the only critique of the ruling class is, you've abandoned us, you've neglected us. Like, no, you're not being abandoned. You're being used and exploited. This is being done to you. So it's sort of tangled up with that complex web of, as I said, rebellious and slavish emotions. Resentment can either be turned inwardly and become a kind of self-perpetuation of class injury. It can become like pervasive depression, or it can become an animated project of revenge, the opportunity to destroy a neighbour. We saw how exciting it was for people on those riots, Those guys stopping traffic and wouldn't let them through unless they were English, meaning white. So you have the combined power, just for a few seconds, of the customs official and the traffic warden. It's a kind of cosplay power. And then, the enthrallment of kill him, beat him, murder him, the stuff that we've seen, setting fire to a hotel where there are migrants there.
Or even the targets list, right? So the target list that was put about for the 8th of August, it was a list of immigration lawyers and places where you could get various kinds of immigration services. There is something very strange about this, because while we might think that there's a sort of process of depoliticization that's happened, people being detached from the real sort of negotiating power of the working class in its organised mode. There's a kind of depoliticization, but it's also an almost kind of fascist nerdery to understand the significance of how the hostile environment works, why it makes immigration lawyers necessary, why it is that this particular piece of architecture becomes the focus. The target list that was circulated was not a collection of migrant hotels. Right, it was a collection of particular pieces of the hostile environment, and there's almost a fascination with this kind of cosplaying, as you described it, of being the state or becoming kind of like state-like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, the idea again is nobody wants to be, or relatively few people want to be seen as kicking those who are weaker than them. And so that, at the level of official discourse, it's always, we're going after the smugglers. It's never,
right,
we're going to attack these refugees, we're going to really brutalize them, which is exactly what they're doing. The argument is that we have to tackle the gangs, the smuggling gangs. At a more plebeian level, the argument will be, we're going after the people who are selling the country out. And quite often, if you get these racists to be interviewed, they will say things like I've got nothing against them, I just want the politicians to look after their own first, that kind of thing. It's a lie, of course. They absolutely do have something against them, but there is a necessary structure of rationalization here. So, yeah, that doesn't surprise me. But also the joy on these protests. I mean, it was a very sickly joy, and frankly, one indicative of a wounded soul. But I saw, for example, in Northern Ireland, there was a mother dancing along the street with her daughter, singing, "Get them out, get them out." I mean, using racist language. That's not unfamiliar to me. There was a lot of that stuff, singing against the Tigs, as they were called, the Catholics. That kind of consolatory supremacism. And so, really, I think this gets us to a crucial point. What disaster nationalism offers in these situations is an addictive cycle of threat and release. The moment at which your ontological security is challenged and threatened, and it gives you a dramatic instance of that, something to mobilize around, something to get excited about, and then released through the violent demonstration of omnipotence. And so there's a sense that for those who were on the streets rioting, beating up Muslims, stabbing people and what have you, setting fires, momentarily they felt like the lords of the earth. Trotsky's very good on this. Trotsky, of course, as a Jewish revolutionary in Russia, pretty well understood pogromism, and he observed pogroms and he wrote about them. And I think he's got a passage in one of his essays writing about the pogroms in 1905, which were used to suppress the 1905 revolution. It was the argument, he said, the trembling slave without shoes can be king for a day. He can do whatever crosses his mind. He can rape a woman, or he can throw a baby from a third-story building or crash its brains in if he has a mind to. That sensation of omnipotence is a much cherished commodity on the far right. And if we look at the pogroms in India, from Gujarat to Delhi, if we look at the vigilantism on the American far right, if we look at the murders of Workers' Party supporters in Brazil, if we look at the death squad populism of Rodrigo Duterte and his successor in the Philippines, where essentially the state and sort of unofficial private death squads went out and murdered drug addicts. And of course, we can talk about the genocide in Gaza. I think that's a very advanced level of disaster nationalism, if I may say so. But what we're seeing here is a tendency where popular collective violence, often enabled by the state, but driven from below, as it were, is not an electoral drawback for the far right, is not embarrassing, is not a difficulty that they have to explain. It is a form of excitement for them and for their base. It mobilizes them and it brings them either to victory or closer to victory than they would have been. I think the canary in the coal mine here was the Gujarat pogrom in 2002, where in essence what the BJP, the far right party, the Hindu Nationalist Party, where the chief minister of Gujarat was Narendra Modi, currently Prime Minister of India. They had done very badly in handling a recent disaster, a real disaster, again, an earthquake. And they were tanking in the polls. And then there was a fire on a train leaving Godhra station. And it affected Hindu pilgrims, far-right Hindu pilgrims, who had been assaulting Muslims on the train earlier and all the rest of it. And there was an immediate assumption that this fire was caused by Muslims, gangs of Muslims who crowded around the train and threw firebombs or whatever. Actually, as far as I can see, the real inquiries that were not politicized hack work thought that it was most likely an accident, not something that was done by anybody. But the BJP and their allies and the police and the businessmen who are involved in this sort of thing incited, supported, funded, and encouraged a sick hunt and murder and rape of Muslims in several days of savage ecstasy in which people were cut to pieces with swords, murder and murder and murder and nothing but, and they were glorying in it. They loved it. They were delighted in it. And they describe in the official reports that look into this, in the evening, as these pyroclastic clouds of hate are receding, some of the survivors are coming out from hiding, And there are guys on the streets playing cricket with the skulls of the slain. And they're laughing at the survivors. The survivors come out trembling, unbelieving, looking at the bodies around them. And they're laughing. Where did they come from? How did they survive? It's an amusement to them. And what happened? The BJP vote, apart from crashing, went up 5%, and it went up most in the areas that saw the worst violence. And Modi did a series of campaign stops, Hindu pride rallies. And he said, if Hindus can have their pride, all the Alis, Malis and Jamalis in the world can't hurt us. The Alis, Malis and Jamalis being those who had just been attacked in a grueling pogrom. And because of that, the BJP got into office and were able to implement the so-called Gujarat development model, which was celebrated by the Congress Party, by Obama, by the Wall Street Journal, by Downing Street, etc., etc. Capitalism with pogromist characteristics was already established at this point, and by 2014, when Modi was elected Prime Minister, was globally accepted. That is what we're up against here. It's... the violence is not an accident, and it's not something that's going to cause the far-right trouble.
When we think about the UK, and also America to some extent, we're thinking about societies that have gone through their mass stage. So they've gone through a point where people were involved at every level of civic organisation in quite an intense way. And then through the process of neoliberal atomization, they have been expelled from that political scene in many cases. People are much more isolated now. This is, of course, features of loneliness and so on. I don't know nearly enough about India to comment on that, but I'm wondering if you see something much more similar in terms of mass mobilizations in India now that we might have seen in, say, Italy in the 20s or Germany in the 30s. Absolutely. That produces the conditions of mass civic mobilization that allows for almost classical fascism to re-emerge in India.
100%. I think India is an outlier in this. I include it in my sweep because I think when we talk about global fascism today, it's the global south that's the real innovator here, not the global north. And we have to provincialize Europe once more. And I think particularly Indian fascism is ahead of the curve and setting the trends. I think that India has a relatively thick and developed civic society, particularly for the far right. It has paramilitary organization. It has social organizations, charitable organizations, a whole network of things. Plus, the Hindu nationalist right has been taking over, the apparatuses of the state, of the universities, of the courts, of the media. So it's a much more integrated and totalizing operation than, say, the kind of Trump campaign or related far-right campaigns in the West and the global North. These are based much more on adventitious alliances of disparate forces established through social industry networks and through mass spectacles like big meetings and so on. And they are, I think, rather than demonstrating enormous strength of their own, I think the crucial thing is they're occupying the spaces vacated by liberal capitalism, as it were. Or one could say that they occupy the spaces that are eroded by the decadence and involution of liberal civilization. So you take Farage. I mean, Farage is, not really somebody who builds. He is somebody who has a nose for a moment. He's a stockbroker. He has a nose for an opportunity. He senses which way the wind's going, and he's been pretty good at that. And, whether it's UKIP or the Brexit Party or Reform UK, the latter two just basically being corporate shells for his project, he intervenes at moments of crisis and breakdown for the Conservative Party, particularly for the Conservative Party, but more generally for the political class. And he's very good at blowing attention bubbles, using social industry to drive surges of attention, gaming media coverage, which then drives up polling, which then can be used to drive surges of attention on social media again and again. All of that sort of stuff. But none of that is based upon a vigorous national organization. I mean, they don't really have a party. They certainly don't have local party associations who know the electorate inside out, who know the streets. If they can beat the Labour Party, it's not because they have better political organisation there. It's purely a negative moment. And I think that a large part of what neonate fascism is about is expressions of decline and involution, and particularly in the global north. It's more complicated in the global south because I think the incipient, inchoate forms of fascism that we're seeing in the global south, and I'm saying that fascism, but it's not yet fascism. This is the crucial thing. We're not trying to overthrow democracy with paramilitaries and so on. And maybe that model will not be what the form that future fascism takes. But incipient fascism, in the global south, it's basically about middle-income countries who have become stuck at a certain point, who have expanded and developed, but are looking at countries like China and their tremendous success. And, what do we do? What do we do about that? Why are we stuck where we are?
And the examples this would be like Brazil and the Philippines.
Brazil, India, the Philippines, absolutely. I think they're all examples on that model. And the far right there basically is, it's not anti-globalist in the way that the far right is in the global north. Absolutely embraces globalization, absolutely opposed to protectionism. Duterte was very clear on this, for example. And, hyper-nationalism in these contexts means treating the nation as a bundle of resources that can be used to attract investors. Basically, what they want is muscular national capitalism. Muscular because you take off the gloves, you strip away all the woke, fluffy constraints, environmentalism, feminism, health and safety laws, all that sort of stuff. And you just let it, you drill, baby, drill. You build. You cut welfare spending and you plow money into businesses to make sure they build stuff. That's the ideology. So it's a much more vigorously social Darwinist form of capitalism. It's quite unlike the fascism of the interwar period, which professed to be anti-capitalist, which professed that there was a need to transcend class. Michael Mann, talks about class transcendence and, quite often involved quite radical proposals for reforms, which were never actually implemented, but that's beside the point. That was their pitch. And so the idea was not to overthrow class, but to change its spiritual meaning, to nationalize it. Well, that's not what's happening today. There is a different approach to class than you would get with the sort of mainstream business conservatism, in as much as there is an acknowledgement of class antagonism, but it's treated more as a failure of moral recognition for white workers in the global north we're talking about, who used to have a certain recognition by virtue of being white morally, and no longer have. In India, it would be much more about, being a Hindu, whatever, so if you're a Hindu woman, if you're a Dalit, an untouchable, whatever, you can take part in the pogroms too. I mean, that was what was notable about the Gujarat pogrom as well. A lot of people who were usually excluded from Hindu nationalism took part. It was a very inclusionary pogrom to that extent, and Modi built his voter base across classes. He didn't do very well among rickshaw drivers, for example, but he built his support across classes. The only demographic that didn't vote strongly for Modi was Muslims. So the argument again and again is that your way to economic uplift, and whenever we're talking about class, is through ethnic uplift and through destroying somebody who's bringing you down. So this neonate fascism that we're seeing across the global south is much less about decline per se, and much more about this frustration and thwarted upward ascent. Whereas I think really what we're seeing in the global north is about relative imperial decline, particularly in the US and in the UK, and in parts of Europe, like France.
The situation in the UK is quite particular. You mentioned just before this interview that this is not a climate book per se, but it is a book that I think will become more relevant the more that climate disaster needs to be substituted with something else.
Yep.
Britain is not especially vulnerable to climate change. This is one of the sort of grand historical injustices of it, that Britain, where, of course, the Industrial Revolution took hold fastest and earliest, is the country that is actually pretty much inured from immune from those consequences at a global scale. Not entirely, of course, but it means that the image of disaster, the profusion of catastrophe, as it accelerates in the next few decades around the world, will not necessarily directly touch people in Britain's lives, or if it does, it will touch them through indirect means. Food prices will increase.
Yeah.
There'll be larger numbers of refugees, very possibly. What does that spectatorship, that feeling of watching a disaster unfold somewhere else, which has been so characteristic of the last year, of watching a genocide happen in Gaza, how do we understand the kind of political valences of spectatorship and a sort of incurred passivity, a feeling what Adam Curtis sometimes calls oh dearism, where you just say, oh, something happened on the news, oh dear, but there's no further engagement. How do you understand the politics of that?
It's not so much that we're watching something happening far away. It's coming to us. It will come to us. I mean, I don't think that we'll be seeing genocide anytime soon in the streets of the UK. But we certainly will be seeing our climate disasters. We'll be seeing our floods. We'll be seeing ruinous storms. Wildfires are actually starting to become we've always had wildfire, and that's a natural thing. But they're starting to become a more problematic aspect of the UK's experience. So we will have this come to us, and just as we have started to experience the pogroms that until relatively recently we hadn't, we'll see the other things too. So really what's going on here is that we are watching the disaster approaching, knowing that it's approaching, and terrified. And we doom scroll and we look at all the footage. Like I remember, maybe it was last year, there was flooding in New York, and it was up to people's eyeballs, it was the whole underground, the metro system was flooded, and the uncanny experience of it being like a film, like something that you would see in Hollywood, and yet being real. And there's a moment of, this is impossible. This can't go on. This can't be allowed, and yet it does, because nobody does anything. And so people adapt to it. Walter Benjamin pointed out, of course, that capitalism is very good at selling our experience of its disasters to us as commodities. That's part of what's going on here. The incurred passivity, I don't think that's caused by doom scrolling. I think doom scrolling exacerbates and makes it worse. I think that passivity is the normal political experience under capitalism, and particularly under neoliberal capitalism. The neoliberal centre depends upon us being made passive, and that's why disaster nationalism is so potentially potent, emotionally speaking, because it doesn't require complete passivity. It does summon your aggression and give it some direction. And I think, what would it be like for the left to be able to act on, to provoke the death drive, as it were, and to direct it, to organise it, to organise ourselves into a more threatening bloc for the ruling class, because they're clearly not threatened by us right now. How could we be a threat? I think that anything that's a threat in the sense of being a handful of activists doing some very clever, skilled protest stuff, that gets shut down fairly quickly. The cops come in and bust it up. They send in special branch to penetrate the organisation, or they just arrest people, and now people are going to be taken off the streets for a few years. What use are you to the movement if you're in the jail for a few years? I don't want to castigate anybody. I'm glad that there are people who are willing to risk arrest, and they are heroic. But it's a form of heroism that is misused at the moment. So I wonder, how can we organise the latent rebelliousness and aggression and turn the experience of class shame, of introverted aggression, into the experience of resentment, and turn that into the experience of a slow-burning, sober, class hate, an unyielding, patient class hate. Class hate is not, as my dear friend Chano Mieville points out in his book on October, it's not dehumanizing. It's not a manifesto for murder. It is about being aware that one has enemies, real enemies, and that one has to patiently forbear and not seek, compensatory satisfactions in, like, I don't know, humiliating Musk on Twitter or something, or whatever, like some pathetic little compensation for being at their mercy and their whim. Holding that hate in reserve, keeping one's powder dry, not engaging in what the Lacanians would call hysterical acting out, where essentially you're really just trying to provoke a reaction from the ruling class. But holding oneself in reserve until one can actually assemble the forces to pose a threat and force a change, that's sober class hatred. So it's a process. It's not. We're not just talking about like let's get people rioting and have a huge amount of destruction. That's not going to work. It's a process of subjectification, and that depends upon, of course, political organization. And about that, unfortunately, our language is a bit sterile and technocratic, because when we think about organization, we think about call lists, funding, databases, that kind of thing. Those are all necessary things, but that's not really what organization is about. Organization, to put it in the simplest possible terms, is about eros, social love. People who start out working together because they need something in common, like wages or whatever it happens to be, and discover, as Marx pointed out, the radical need for one another. And Mike Davis, in his History of Socialist and Labour Organising, makes the point that, the political economists of the bourgeoisie could never figure out why workers, even when it cost them, even when they lost money, struck in defence of their union. They preferred to keep their union. The union came to matter to them more than the money itself, which was supposedly the rationale for being in a union. And that's just because the old story about enlightened self-interest that we get from political economy, or the contemporary version, it's the economy stupid. It's never described how people actually are. It's never described how people really behave. Rather, it's described how people ought to be governed, according to the liberal bourgeoisie, which is essentially to pit one's avaricious passions against one's potentially seditious passions. And this is something that, disaster nationalists know too well. They know very well that, you can tell people that, it's against your interest to vote for Brexit. It's going to cause an economic disaster. It's going to ruin you. It's going to drive people out of work. Your neighbours will lose jobs. You might lose your job. And they'll say in the polls and in the surveys, good, I'm willing to lose my job. Why? Well, because people aren't just economic machines. They want things other than jobs and wages and whatever. What they want is the good life, to put it crudely. And when we talk about growth, quite often what people are really talking about is a share of the good life. And the good life is contested, and it can be politicized in one or other direction. Disaster nationalists have their version. We have ours. But it does mean that whenever we talk about interests, people acting on their quote-unquote material interests, I have a material interest in Gaza. I mean, not because what happens there in the immediate term will affect me one way or the other, but because I can't sleep at night for knowing that they are murdering children in Gaza, for knowing that parts of Beirut, where I have friends and comrades, are being bombed. Why would the horizons of interest stop at your wallet? It's an absurd picture. Disaster nationalists know this. And the left, we need to wrap our heads around it, because one thing it does mean is you can't hope to undercut this form of incipient fascism by offering people bread and butter, right? This sort of minimal social democratic response. Not going to work. Of course, we need bread and butter, and it's very pleasant, but as I say in the book, we don't love it. When the things you love are the things you sacrifice for. If you love your children, it's not because they give you more money, more energy, more free time, more time with your friends. It's because, in a way, they need something from you, and their very neediness cannot but draw your love. And it's the same with international solidarity, or with any kind of solidarity. We all need something from one another. We're needy, and that draws forth love.
I think this relationship between the extremely stick figure version of the human that gets produced from the notion of interests in economics and the passions, as you sort of split them up in the book, I think that's incredibly important for understanding how politics works. But there's also this other aspect. I want to quibble slightly with your formulation that people want a share of the good life. There's also something on the right about wanting a share of the heroic death.
Oh, absolutely. Well. Absolutely.
And the relationship between the good life and the heroic death. I mean, I can't remember the exact figures, but in 2016, this is in some ways a kind of a morbidly funny version of this. Something like 25% of people who planned to vote for Trump thought that he could probably cause a nuclear war.
Yeah.
Right. So people are voting for someone who they think might kill them by accident, or in terms of escalatory process. And America is not a place that imagines itself immune from nuclear war, right? The luster of nuclear war as a form of destruction is incredibly, I think, central to the post-war imaginary.
Yeah.
To the extent that, and this is another sort of, I think, example of a disaster nationalism dynamic playing out, when Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans, George Bush goes on the TV and says, look, imagine if this had been a nuclear strike, and then argues in favor of beefing up the military in further defense spending. Yeah. There's this substitution of the real disaster of Hurricane Katrina, which is a disaster not only natural, but of poverty, of racism, of all the manifold things that construct the South in America. So this question of death, this question of what is the economy of death, the psychological economy of being able to wield death against your enemies, of course, but also of receiving your death well, or of having the good death. How do you understand this as it plays out through disaster nationalism?
So I think that in many ways, contemporary incipient fascism much better maps onto what Deleuze and Guattari said, that fascism liberates a popular desire for suicide, than, say, the fascism of the interwar period, which, I mean, I think they were probably thinking of the Nero Decree, which was Hitler's order to go back and bomb German cities to stop the Jewish Bolsheviks from gaining access to the material wealth of the German nation, etc., etc. But a striking and extraordinary thing to do, and they actually did it. And of course, the suicidal drag of the war, the refusal to end the war, the punishment and murder of soldiers or anybody who refused to continue fighting even when it was patently lost. That suicidal impulse, I think, is built into fascism in its way. And I think that's partly because of the addictive escalatory spiral of it that Adorno talks about. He talks about how the anti-Semitic fantasy could start off with a simple, relatively minor grudge. They think a bit much of themselves. They're striving, they're constant worming away, all that kind of stuff. And then it becomes, they dominate everything, and I'm sick of them running everything. And then it becomes, they should be driven out of public life, or they should be driven out of the country. And then it becomes annihilation. And nothing is going to satisfy this, because the whole point of a phobic object is that, like any other symptom, it exists to avoid the solution. There's no point, it's not there for a solution, it's there to perpetuate itself. And if you think about your common or garden phobias, like fear of spiders or whatever, killing a lot of spiders not going to stop you being an arachnophobe. Not going to stop you because it maintains a symptomatic position within your psychic economy. Well, imagine that's racism. No matter how many of these enemies you identify, Antifa, cultural Marxists, bathroom predators, the love jihad, this where supposedly Muslim men in India are supposed to be wooing and seducing Hindu girls as a war on the demographic fabric of the nation. You think about all these enemies, you kill them all, however many you can identify, it's never going to stop. Nothing is ever going to get you to the point where you feel placated and satisfied, because ultimately that's a displacement activity. It's not what it's really about.
What's it really about?
Well, as I've said, I think that these feed on forms of disaster that are imminent to life under contemporary late capitalism. And I think that I think that mass extinction is the horizon here, not climate change. I think climate change is the wrong heuristic. I think that even if we humans don't go extinct, the overriding trajectory of capitalism is to destroy and etiolate and decay and diminish the very fabric of biological existence as such, because it exists to take the material processes of life and convert them into sources of evanescent abstract value. And so I think that the drive of contemporary capitalism is going to be to make life much harder in general. And that will manifest in lots of different ways, and it will be racially distributed and ethnically and nationally and religiously and so on, and it will be distributed above all globally by class. So the bourgeoisie will try to extract every last drop of value from a dying planet, dying biosphere. And meanwhile, disaster nationalism will try to convert it into zero-sum ethnic competition for the remaining goods of the earth. And democracy, of course, is susceptible to this brutal torsion. Michael Mann writes about this in The Dark Side of Democracy, where the demos becomes the ethnos. Particularly unstable democracies in some sort of crisis, and that's where we're headed. So there's a part of this, the death drive, as it were, which is about a part of it that's, burn everything up, drill, baby, drill, etc., and just enjoy the rigors of it, enjoy the destruction of it. And then there's a part of it that's, no, let's turn this into a social Darwinist war on superfluous or out-of-place biology, mutant biology. It's the nomadic migrants who are destroying the environment and polluting our land. It's the ethnic other. It's other populations that are surplus to requirement. All of that kind of stuff. But I think really, I mean, to come back to the heroic death, probably the apt example would be the lone wolf, because every single one of them, almost to a man, and they're almost all men, want and contemplate dying in the act. They write about it in their manifestos. They try and instigate, like, death by cop, kill me, I've got a gun. They beg for death. They try and kill themselves. Breivik, who really started this sequence of lone wolf massacres with the sort of cut and paste mimetic manifesto, I think described himself as having a less than 5% chance of surviving to complete all his goals. And he was using gamer language here. And that's very important for this sort of strand of lone wolfery. You frequently see on their fora, like 8chan, them encouraging the murderer to get the high score, kill as many as possible.
And the footage of the Christchurch attack has been mimetically sort of absorbed into the video game language as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, like he's wearing a HUD. And people are able to participate in this virtualized mass killing. And, actually, this was already a place, if you remember, there was Omar Mateen carried out an attack on a Florida nightclub. While he was carrying out the massacre, he was checking his phone to see if he'd got on Twitter yet, see if people were talking about it, as if it wasn't real until it was being reported. Reminds me, actually, of that time when during the Gulf War when CNN cut to their reporters in the Middle East to find out, what's going on? They said, well, we were just watching CNN to find out what's going on here. We don't know. It's only happening if it's on the news or if it's on your feed. There's an element of that. But basically, throughout this, the general tendency has been to seek, or at least to fantasize about, death. And, the mawkishness of these lone wolf manifestos frequently are in that style, in the context of the writers, the authors, considering themselves as dead, and giving you an account of their lives while they were alive and how they came to their heroic action of, butchering people in a shopping centre or whatever. So yes, I think this is what you have instead of utopianism. The utopian horizon of interwar fascism was, we're going to colonize, we're going to expand, we're going to go to the east, living space. You're going to have a better life because of that. You're going to have better land, you're going to have a bigger house, you're going to have lots of resources, because when we basically murder all these people, we're going to take their resources. You're going to have slaves. You're going to be better off. That's the fantasy. Today, it's nothing like that. Today, it's at most it's bordered. We're going to shut everybody out. We're under threat, we're under siege, we're going to border ourselves, and we're going to return normality to what it was a few decades ago, before all this politically correct stuff started. Really feeble. But the only utopian horizon is actually ecstatic death. That's the utopian horizon, where essentially I mean something, and I achieve a confluence of my life's course with a meaningful political and personal structure. And I fuse together my personal grievances with political grievances. And this is the kind of the symptomatic construction of the Lone Wolf Manifesto. Invariably, it's not just the personal and the political, and the divide between them break down. It's not one thing or the other, it's both. And they're woven together. And in the act of disappearing from the scene, they achieve some sort of unity to otherwise completely pointless, absurd and chaotic lives. And to say that they're completely pointless, chaotic and absurd is not to be heartlessly satirical. It's something that most people are experiencing one way or another. And it's something that we're all having to resist one way or another. Which is why ultimately I do come back to this notion of eros, of building eros. Capitalism basically acculturates you to the idea of universal hate. Even if nobody can exist like that, even if we can't live like that, believing in that. Basically it says everybody's your competitor. There's no such thing as a public interest. Neoliberalism brings these precepts to the fore. No such thing as a public interest. Anybody who talks about the public interest is a hypocrite trying to con you. Anybody who talks about solidarity is trying. You could look at your wallet. They're trying to pickpocket you. Anybody who talks about resisting hunger and need, those people are either statist bureaucrats maximizing their utility, or leeches on the teat of the state. And you need to get rid of them. Anybody could be the one that sticks the knife in, because it's universal competition and everybody's just trying to maximize their own utility with their own particular streams of capital. So even a friend, even a romantic relationship, even a love, basically your wife might maximize your utility for now, just through a fortuitous alignment of utility-seeking behaviors. But tomorrow it might be your secretary, or, it might be maybe, you can treat and betray on everyone, and that's the world that it describes. And that's a world that becomes very plausible given the privations and disappointments and difficulties that people live with, and given the isolation and loneliness that people are going through more and more. According to sociological surveys, people are becoming less sociable, they're becoming more insular, they're less interested in dating, less interested in sex, etc., etc. So the only thing that really overcomes that, and that's a very bleak and melancholic world, is where people get together, where ultimately the purpose becomes, as I say, one another. Like, for example, I volunteer in a church. All right. This is just to help out refugees. Everybody who's there is told the rule here is unconditional love for whoever walks in the door. Now, if you've never contemplated that as an ideal, a social ideal, unconditional love, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds absurd. Imagine the government saying, from now on there will be unconditional love throughout the land, nobody would believe it. People would all be conditioned to think that's just ridiculous. Oh, lovely idea. But in that church, that's basically how it works. No matter what you've done, no matter who you are, you may have been a murderer at some point in your life, you may have done something awful, or you may just be ordinarily, as they say, sinful. But you come in and you get help, and people are there for you, whatever you need, whatever they can do. And the practice of being involved in that kind of organization and being around people who are doing this, not because they're getting any money out of it or anything like that, but simply because that's the kind of society they want to live in, makes it more plausible.
So the example that you end the book with is, well, not end, but like the example that takes up a chapter of the book is genocide, the genocide in Gaza. Talk to us about the dynamics of disaster nationalism as they appear in that particular example.
So the book is structured as a sort of progressive spiral, starting with the sort of ordinary currents of existential revenge that circulate around society, class society breathing resentment and so on, the disasters, the ordinary disasters that afflict people's lives, and then the ways in which they are instrumentalized and turned into cyber war, sexual bullying, fantasies of extreme evil, erotic evil or whatever else, into mob violence, paramilitary violence, pogroms, the armed shitstorm, as I put it, pseudo-insurrections, and then ultimately genocide. And I think the telos of this is genocide. So what we see in Gaza unfolding, really, I mean, in some ways it's unique because Israel is one of the last settler colonial, I think it's the only settler colonial outposts remaining today, that is still settler colonial in its internal relations and in its relation to an externalized political subject. But it's also quite like the other examples, in as much as the same patterns of neoliberalization, of gutting of social collectivities, of social misery and despair and pessimism, a deeply pessimistic society, a deeply unequal society, the nationalist utopia that was bought at the expense of ethnic cleansing in the post-war period, and the permanent subjugation of the Palestinians within Israeli society, and constant war-making without. That was briefly purchased, nonetheless did involve some idea of a kind of, they thought of it as socialism. I think that was always a lie. It was never what it was about. But it was some form of social compact, some form of class peace, some form of... There were forms of collectivity that, were intrinsically exclusionary, but also offered something to those who were participating in them. I think that's all gone now. I mean, I think that's been dying for a long time, and I think the settler movement that took over after the victory of 1967 pointed in a new direction. You know, we're not talking about building little kibbutzes and what have you. We're now talking about millenarian domination. We're out to conquer, and this land is going to belong to us because God said so. So I think that's where it's been headed, and the unions have been declining there, just like in everywhere else, and actually I think the Israeli left is residual now. I mean, it scarcely exists. If you do evince any criticism of the war on Gaza, for instance, I mean, even a humanitarian critique, you're not really allowed to have a political critique. But a humanitarian critique on Facebook can get you locked up in sort of solitary confinement, or it can get you hunted by a right-wing mob. So that's a very advanced state of fascistic development. And it's an ideal case where you actually have a neighbour that you are constantly trying to destroy, and where you can experience political life as the ongoing threat to your ontological security, which threat is abated by violent displays of omnipotence. And, this has been building for some time. You could go back and look at the 2014 war on Gaza. There were far-right parades and demonstrations in the streets, and they were singing songs like, "Ole, ole, ole, there are no more children left in Gaza. Ole, 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 Gaza is a cemetery. And you can look at the 2012 war and see where they put chairs out on top of the hills to watch the bombing with popcorn and what have you, like it was a movie. That has been part of Israeli culture for a long time, and Netanyahu's been in more or less constantly since, I think, 2009, with far-right coalition partners, and the far-right keeps expanding, not continuously, but in a syncopated rhythm, and keeps increasing their grip on the Israeli state. So that's a process that is fairly well advanced. And I think the lethal point in all of these processes, wherever we're talking about, is what I would call the dialectic of mutual radicalization. And that is an idea that I got from just looking at the development of Third Reich violence during the 1930s when, for example, the Nuremberg laws were hastened into existence by mob violence, often involving Nazi Party members, but not at the initiative of the Nazi Party hierarchy, and often involving them in direct confrontation with the police. Now, the police were the backbone of the Nazi regime. They just wanted to keep order. They were not hostile to the protesters, but the protesters were saying, we've got to stop these Jews marrying Gentile women, etc., etc. And it was involving them in serious disorder, serious riots, confrontation with the police. And that pushed the regime to expedite its policies in that regard, which legitimized them. So there were forms of civic organization and protest that were permissible within that context of a totalitarian dictatorship. And basically existed to... I don't want to talk about this in a functionalist way, as if there was some sort of plan or internal logic to this that was necessarily functional, but it did work in a way that where the rank and file was able to push ahead and riot and protest and all the rest of it, and thus express the sort of aggression that's already circulating around, they can push a bit further than the even a dictatorship is necessarily willing to go at any particular moment. When you're not in a dictatorship, when you're in a democratic system with bourgeois legality, the mob can go further than you are legally permitted as an elected president or prime minister. And then you can respond to that by defending the mob, legitimizing what it's done, and supplementing its violence with state violence. And the example that comes to mind immediately is Donald Trump and the Republican right making a saint of Kyle Rittenhouse. Kyle Rittenhouse goes to a protest, armed, loaded for bear, kills 3 people. There's no way on this earth that you can reasonably claim that he was sufficiently threatened to justify the murder of those 3 people. He went there to kill people. That's why he was there, as far as I'm concerned. But they made him into a saint because he looks like the Milky Bar Kid, and he's a young guy, he's not like if his victims were not white, that might have changed the political coloration of it just a little bit. I think the fact that his victims were white made it less visibly a lynching on his part. So he just happened to be, an ideal candidate for becoming the face of vigilantist violence in America. And so the Republican right, the Christian right, Trump administration, all immediately swing behind Rittenhouse, swing behind his legal defense. They start raising funds for him. He becomes a star at the National Convention. And also, of course, Trump immediately dispatches federal paramilitaries to start abducting protesters on the streets of Oregon and elsewhere, and orders the extrajudicial killing of somebody who was suspected in the murder of a far-right protester from Patriot Prayer, and describes that extrajudicial murder as revenge on Twitter. So he's supplemented collective violence with state violence. and legitimized it and protected it and encouraged it. And so the mob feels they can go further next time. What we got in Israel is that for years there's been these settler-soldier pogroms in the West Bank. The soldiers are not formally acting on the orders of their superiors, but they've got a wide remit to do what they want. The settlers lead the pogroms. The soldiers come along to give them backup and to shoot anybody who tries to stop them. They're building up a rhythm of terror, but usually it's aimed against poorly defended villages and towns. And it's more about building up the practice than anything else. But then you get the unexpected attack from the 6 or 7 militia groups that participated in the Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, 7th of October last year. And the far right turned its attention to Gaza. They thought Gaza had been placated. Obviously, they were wrong. And immediately, they're recruiting all these reservists who disproportionately, they're going to be 20-something men, and they've been socialized in institutions that dehumanize Palestinians. And they disproportionately are of the religious right, the Dati Lumi. And they overwhelmingly oppose a two-state settlement or anything like that. They don't want to give the Palestinians anything. And you send hundreds of thousands of them into a war where they're told, primed for every quarter, that the enemy is Palestinian civilians. They're told this by government ministers, they're told this by rabbis, they're told this by national media, by journalists, they're told this by their commanders. The overriding myth of Amalek becomes instrumental in this. And they go in there and they're told there are no written rules of engagement. It's really important. No written rules of engagement. So that gives enormous leverage and latitude to field commanders and their inferiors, their subordinates. And they have a certain set of priorities that they can, like directives that they can interpret as they wish. So, for example, once you use a home as a base, don't leave it as it was, because then you'll be leaving behind evidence. So they interpret that to mean burn down the house. And so that becomes part of, the overriding ambition to destroy Amalek, burn down the house. Don't allow the enemy to get any weapons. Okay, so that means that when I see an aid truck, I'm going to shoot at it, I'm going to burn it. In fact, if you look at the eyewitness testimony by refuseniks soldiers who've come out of Gaza and said, I'm not doing this, they tell you that the rule is shoot whatever you want, for whatever reason. If you feel threatened, shoot. If you see some guy looking out the window, shoot. If you don't see some guy looking out the window and you're bored, shoot. Shoot everywhere. And not just with guns, with tanks, with rocket propellers, everything. It's just constant chaos there. And constant liberty to do what you will. And at the grassroots of that military, they want to go much further than the military leadership does. Military leadership was already committed to a genocidal process. I mean, you just had to listen to Yoav Gallant's statement. They don't want to leave Gaza. They will not let them leave Gaza. They've said again and again, they make their videos advertising their war crimes for TikTok and whatever else, and they turn it into little jokes, caveman humor. And they say, if you try and take us out of here, we'll be turning the guns on you next. And I think that this dialectic between the leadership and the base is driving it forward, because there's no point at which they can say in Gaza, we've got victory, now we can go home. And in fact, there's no point at which they can say we've destroyed Hamas, because they haven't. So the next step is obviously to go into Lebanon, which is convenient because the main opposition parties are saying, let's invade Lebanon. And the next thing would be to attack Iran, and so on. This is a system that is designed for constant escalation.
There's a feeling that I got from the book, which is that there's sort of a almost an indefinite multifacetedness to what you're trying to describe as disaster nationalism.
Yeah.
And this is something I want to kind of come back to, because lots of people who have written about the far right, myself included, have tried to make various kinds of typologies, various kinds of splits, partly, at least in my case, to try and facilitate an anti-fascism that could see where the contradictions were, where the tensions were, and therefore push on those in sort of a wedge strategy. Where do you see those in the far right at the moment? Like, where are those points where you can push on it and split the movement? One of the common ways of phrasing this is between civic nationalists and ethno-nationalists. Civic nationalists being people who, broadly speaking, are interested in citizenship and the question of like the membership of the group on essentially civic bases, as opposed to ethno-nationalists who are interested in the racial harmony, racial unity. And some anti-fascists will tell you these two groups of people are sort of split, and you need to drive the hard racists away from the people who are more sort of civic nationalistically inclined. Like, for example, Farage would be probably a good example. You need to drive like Tommy Robinson, who sort of straddles this split, away from him and so on. And that's the kind of part of the anti-fascist strategy. Where do you see those splits?
I think that's a waste of time. I think that Farage... actually, if you pay attention to his political behaviour in his past, I think the line between civic and ethnic nationalism is a lot more porous than we've been led to believe. I'm not against, leveraging splits wherever we can. I don't think that's one of the more fundamental ones. I do accept that there's a difference between ethnic and civic nationalism, because, like, the SNP, although there is a kind of really odious ALBA wing, like a wing that's like up its own arse with ethnic nationalist fantasies and turfism and all the rest of it. Basically, I think the SNP is bourgeois progressive, more progressive than Labour, for example, okay? Catalan nationalism. I mean, it's got a popular leftist base, and it's got a bourgeois liberal leadership. Palestinian nationalism is self-defense. It's self-defense. I mean, actually, I think it's better self-defense when it's not nationalist. I think in its nationalist iteration, it becomes kind of two-state, all we need is to build up an equivalent structure to the Israelis. Don't think that's going to get them to liberation. So, no. Where are the splits? I think there are splits along various axes. One of them is sex. Sex happens to be incredibly important to this inchoate fascism. There's a split between those who, for example, are genuinely conservative in the sense that they are opposed to transgressive behaviours and favour the regimentation of some sort of sexual order where essentially it's heteronormative again, strongly heteronormative, strongly repressive of women and queers and trans people and so on. And then there are those who, they're for all that, but really they're much more interested in their version of anomic freedom, which is the freedom, as Andrew Tate would tell you, to rape. He said, I'm not a rapist, but I moved to Romania so that I could be free because it's possible to rape there. Well, okay, so you are a rapist. I mean, that's what you're saying. And I remember The Guardian interviewed some of his fans, and one of them was like, well, he can rape whoever he wants. He's a top G, meaning he can rape me if he wants, because there's always this fateful ambiguity between wanting to be him and wanting to be his victim. But there is this division between the kind of transgressive wing and the conservative wing. That's one thing. And we've seen that explode in various ways. For example, you remember Milo Yiannopoulos?
Yes.
Yeah, getting into trouble for alleged paedophilic sentiments or statements, which I think were examples of him trying to be a provocateur and exploit certain feelings around that, like the more conservative alt-right, cast him out, didn't want anything to do with him. So they lost quite a useful spokesperson someone who had gone on Bill Maher, because Bill Maher's a fucking idiot, who had been courted by the national media, who was doing tours all across the country, you know, this glamorous queen who says all these, you know, odious things, but weirdly compelling for quite a lot of the liberal sort of intelligentsia. So they lost him. So that's a useful kind of division to have. I think there was also, in terms of the men's rights stuff, there's a split between the incels and the sort of Tate wing. And it's, you know, sometimes it's only latent. You know, I think because the incels, especially those who tend towards blackpilling, are committed to an idea in which they are the victims of a sexual tyranny. You know, dominated by the Chads and the Stacys and the Tyrones and what have you, all these stereotypes. And they're caught between a kind of fatalism in which this is just evolutionary biology, my chin's not big enough, and so therefore I'm at the bottom of the hierarchy, I don't have good erotic market value. But the people who, you know, claim to be the silverbacks, and claim to have, you know, like the rights of a primordial father, you know, like Tate or Trump, the pussy grabber, you know, they can do whatever they want. There is latently a tension between them, between those who have everything and those who have nothing. Ultimately, though, I don't really think that the incels' complaint should be taken at face value. Their complaint allegedly is they don't get enough sex. They're involuntarily celibate. Well, we all are some of the time, and sometimes for quite long periods of time. That's just normal. It's part of the human experience. But I think that really what we're talking about here is a kind of erotophobia, which is manifested in the way in which they hate women. The ways in which men who want to have sex with women are misogynist is different from the ways in which men who don't want to have sex with women are misogynist. So I think that ultimately women are being made into a scapegoat for the collapse of their erotic desire. And I think that the tension here is between, do you want to desire again? If you want to desire again, shall we have renewed prohibitions? You know, a renewed hierarchy, because that will, you know, reinstate a desire as a desire to know your place. And also, you know, like we all know that there's a relationship between prohibition and desire. The more you're told you can't have it, the more you want it, etc. So in a way, you know, finding the right prohibitions is part of the solution to the generalized collapse of desire. Or do you want to experience desire as a kind of uninhibited, anomic libertinism where you can just, like the whole world is predator-prey relations and everybody is out for exploitation, and so you can do whatever you want. That's the kind of tension that's there. There's also a tension between those who are more sort of vigorously social Darwinist and neoliberal in their predicates, because contemporary fascist culture has internalized neoliberalism to a great degree. And those who genuinely have a kind of nationalist class politics, which is to say a kind of sense of a hatred of the kind of the financiers, the rich, the ruling class. This is not exclusively anti-Semitic in the way that it was, although there is still anti-Semitism there, especially in the Soros stuff. But there is a sense of class hatred combined with a more overriding hatred of the other. And there's a tension between those two wings. So there's an ambiguity because, you know, fascist culture has been undergoing this transformation since the 2000s when effectively the American culture sort of permeated the European far right, which became very pro-Israel and Islamophobic in that context, and started to permeate the sort of far right of the global south as well. And so I think that that's an unresolved situation and a source of a great deal of productive tension. There's also the axis of labor organizing. I don't know if you noticed this, but there was, I think this was last year or earlier this year, there was auto workers' strike in the United States, where Trump was asked, you know, what do you have to say about this? And these are people who obviously have been let down by the Democratic Party. He claims to speak for the white working class, or the so-called middle class that's been betrayed, sold out to manufacturers moving to East Asia, etc., etc. This is American carnage. Does he have anything useful to say to them? He goes to speak to a non-union shop at the invite of the boss and says, the union should back me because electric cars are coming and they're going to kill you. They're going to kill your industry. Nothing to do with it. Had no cut through whatsoever. Biden, very cleverly, turns up the picket line. I mean, he's the only kind of Democratic leader who would do something like that, and you're damn sure Kamala Harris isn't going to do something like that. But anybody who had the slightest intelligence, political intelligence, would see that there is a moment whenever there's a strike or something like that on, where Trump's so-called class credentials are going to be brutally exposed. And there's going to be moments like that all the way through. So I think that to some extent, this is going to be about detonating the contradictions within disaster nationalism, because it is and is yet not completely formed and necessarily contradictory formation. But I think far more important is what we organise in its stead. And that's something that we have been struggling to work out for the last 20, 30 years. There's been experimentations with horizontalist forms of organization, with kind of adventurist kind of climate action, with return to the party, but in the form of taking over the Labour Party, which in a way was a huge opportunity, but was also a kind of poison chalice, because it meant being at the mercy of the kind of scumbags and black pillars who run that sort of organization. I think at this moment we've been sort of in a bit of stunned demoralization for the last 5 years, when in fact I think we could have been organizing some form of national federation of all the efforts that are going on. And I would prefer that took the form of a party of some kind. And I would think that that party should be supporting, rather than leaving it to unknown independents and just letting them do stuff on their own, we should be trying to centralize and federate those initiatives and support those candidates, whether they want to be part of the party or not. I think we could be more efficacious in breaking through the permanent subalternization of the left, the internalization of defeat. I think we could actually pose a real threat. It would have a positive effect on the political system and a positive effect on the capitalist class, spread a lively terror. But it would also have a positive effect on us. It would break through the tendency towards demoralization and towards internalizing our anxieties and towards taking things out on one another, fighting pointlessly in online discourse, displacement activity, trolling journalists online and stuff like that, waste of time. So I'm very much of the party. I think we need a party. And I think that its focus should be on supporting the kinds of things that are happening in terms of Gaza, in terms of climate, and getting ahead of being proactive in responding to the crises and disasters of the age, which are only going to pile up. We need to get ahead of this. We're lagging far behind. And that's why the initiative is in the hands of the far right, not because of their overweening strength, but because we have been a bit slow.
Richard Seymour, thank you very much for coming on Novara FM.
All right, thank you.